Don't shoot, please. She's just a kid. That was what Isaac Thompson screamed from the front porch as armed officers stormed his house in the middle of the night. Inside, his 17-year-old daughter, Jade, stood frozen, holding a textbook in one hand, a glass of water in the other, caught between the noise of sirens and the cold glare of flashlights. One officer raised his weapon, a flash of light. Then, the deafening crack of gunfire. 3 shots pierced her chest, dropping Jade to the floor without a sound. Hours later, Isaac sat in the same chair where Jade used to do her homework, staring at a picture frame of her high school graduation. The news played in the background. The police chief's voice rang out, a tragic case of mistaken identity. No charges will be filed. Isaac's grip tightened on the frame, his rough, calloused hands shaking. The pain and rage inside him grew silent, but heavy. He whispered to no one, as if the walls might answer, "They're going home to their families tonight. But not me, not her." Days later, the front of a police cruiser exploded. A note bolted to the wreckage. "Wrong house. Wrong girl. Your turn." This is the story of how Isaac, a grieving father with nothing left to lose, took matters into his own hands, hunted down every officer involved in his daughter's death, one by one. The sun was beginning to set over the quiet neighborhood of Oakwood, casting long shadows across the cul-de-sac. The air was still warm, yet a slight breeze carried the sweet smell of freshly cut grass and grilled food. Marlon Black stood by the grill in his small but well-kept backyard, his big hands deftly flipping chicken thighs, the skin sizzling against the heat. A faded red apron hung from his neck, the words Pitmaster Extraordinaire written across it in white, slightly peeling letters. He'd earned that title over the years, one barbecue at a time. His daughter Amira sat on the porch steps, her legs tucked beneath her, a notebook resting on her lap. She was busy scribbling notes, the flick of her pen accompanied by the occasional glance at the sky, where the fading light turned the clouds into soft pink and orange streaks. At 17, Amira was already a force to be reckoned with, a high school senior who had recently received an acceptance letter to Howard University, the first in their family to be accepted to college. Her dreams were big, and Marlon knew she would chase them without hesitation. He'd raised her to be strong, independent, and unapologetically herself. "You ever thought about what you want to study once you get there?" Marlon called out, his voice deep and warm, cutting through the steady hum of the neighborhood. Amira looked up from her notebook, her eyes shining in the fading sunlight. "I've been thinking about psychology. Maybe sociology too. I don't know yet." She smiled, the kind of smile that made her look even younger than she was, full of excitement and possibility. "I just know I want to help people. Dad, I want to make a difference." Marlon smiled as he flipped the last piece of chicken onto the grill. It was the perfect night, quiet, peaceful, with only the sounds of distant children laughing and the occasional car passing by. In a world that often seems to move too fast, this moment felt like one they could hold on to forever. "You're gonna do great, Amira. I've seen the way you work. Ain't no way they won't notice you at Howard." Amira's smile widened, her eyes full of gratitude. She reached out and grabbed her father's hand, giving it a quick squeeze before letting go to jot something down in her notebook. Marlon could see the excitement in her movements, the eagerness to embrace everything that lay ahead. It made him proud. He'd spent so many years working hard as a mechanic, building a life for them, just the two of them, after his wife passed away when Amira was just a toddler. The love they shared was the bedrock of their existence. It had been enough to get them through the darkest times, and it was the foundation of their bright future. "Dad, what do you think about me moving to DC? What if I get too homesick?" Amira asked, her voice suddenly quieter, more thoughtful. Turned his attention to her, his brow furrowing slightly. He didn't expect her to voice that concern. He hadn't even thought about it, how she would be so far away, in a new city, surrounded by strangers. He thought about the years they'd spent together in Oakwood, the many nights spent in this backyard, her laughter ringing in the air. She'd been his little girl for so long, and now she was about to step out into the world on her own. "You're not gonna get homesick. You're gonna be busy doing what you've always done, shining." He nodded toward the grill with a grin. "You'll be so focused on your work, your goals, that the homesickness won't stand a chance." Amira looked down at her notebook, again, but there was a quiet hesitation in her eyes. "What if things are different there? You know, because I'm black." The question hung in the air. A quiet truth Marlon had always known would eventually come up. Marlon paused for a moment, his grip tightening on the tongs in his hand. He'd never wanted her to carry the weight of the world, especially not at her age, but he couldn't shield her from reality forever. He knew all too well the struggles his people faced, especially in a city like Washington, D.C., where the vibrant community was just as often burdened by the weight of racism and discrimination. He turned to face her, his expression soft but serious. Amira, you're gonna face stuff that's unfair, no doubt. But don't ever let them make you feel like you don't belong. You're just as worthy as anyone else walking through those gates. And if they ever make you feel less than, you stand tall, you speak your truth, you keep pushing forward, because what's meant for you will always find its way to you. Amira nodded slowly, her eyes holding something deeper, now something more mature. She'd always known about the world's injustice, about the weight her skin carried, but this was different. She was beginning to understand that her journey wasn't just about academic success. It was about surviving and thriving in a world that sometimes didn't want to see her succeed. Her desire to make a difference wasn't just a dream, was a mission. I know, Dad. I'll make sure they hear me. Her voice was steady, determined. She was ready. The evening stretched on with comfortable silence, the only sound being the occasional crackle of the grill. Marlon couldn't help but glance over at his daughter from time to time, taking in her strength and vulnerability. In that moment, he wished he could protect her from all the hardships that might come her way. But he knew she was strong, and that was enough. She had his love, his pride, and the foundation of everything he'd worked for. As the light finally dipped below the horizon, Amira stood up and walked over to the grill, her notebook forgotten on the steps. She stretched her arms overhead, the soft glow of the porch light illuminating her face. I'm gonna do it, Dad. I'm going to make a name for myself. You'll see. Marlon smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He reached out and ruffled her hair gently, something he hadn't done since she was little. I don't need to see it, baby girl, I already know. And for the first time in a long while, the world felt safe. Nothing would ever change the bond they shared, but life doesn't always let you live in peace. Marlon couldn't know it yet, but the storm was coming. A storm he would never be able to outrun, no matter how much he loved his daughter, no matter how hard he worked to protect her. Because that night, as the warmth of the grill and the gentle hum of the night filled the air, the world was about to change forever. The sound of a soft evening breeze was suddenly pierced by the deafening roar of sirens, the screech of tires, and the metallic clang of doors slamming shut. Marlon froze, the spatula in his hand midair, his attention immediately snapping toward the street. A convoy of police vehicles had turned the corner, their flashing lights illuminating the neighborhood with a pulsing red and blue glow. Heart skipped a beat. The noise was too loud, too close. That it was supposed to be a peaceful evening. A quiet night spent enjoying the last bits of summer with his daughter, talking about her future, grilling the chicken she loved so much. But now, in the blink of an eye, everything was changing. Dad, what's going on? Amira asked, her voice shaky as she stood up from the porch steps, peering out toward the street. She was confused, just like him. There had never been this kind of chaos in their little cul-de-sac. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Marlon took a step forward, his body tense, muscles locked. He set the spatula down on the grill and moved toward her. His gut twisted. Something was off, but he couldn't place it. The sirens seemed to reverberate off the walls of the house. They were too close, too frantic. Stay inside, Amira, now. His voice was sharp, an instinct taking over. He turned and started toward the front door. Why, Dad? What's happening? She called after him, her voice full of panic now. Marlon reached for the door handle, but before he could turn it, the first banging knock hit like a thunderclap. Boom, boom, boom. The sound rattled through his bones. The police, they were at the door. Open up, this is the police. A voice barked from the other side, low and authoritative. There was no mistaking it. This was no ordinary traffic stop. Marlon's mind raced. Who were they after? What were they doing here? He'd done nothing wrong. His daughter had done nothing wrong. The next sound was even worse, the sound of a battering ram. Wham, wham, wham. The door shook violently in its frame, the wood splintering and cracking. Marlon's heart pounded in his chest. He had a split second, just a moment, to decide what to do. Amira, get back, Marlon shouted, turning to push his daughter toward the hallway. The door gave way, crashing inward with the force of a storm, the metal door handle bending as it was torn from its hinges. Time seemed to stretch, but everything was happening too fast. The door flew open. Officers in full tactical gear stormed into the living room. Marlon barely had time to raise his hands in defense before he was tackled to the floor by one of them. A knee pressed hard into his back, and the weight of the officer's body slammed him into the ground. Get down, on the floor, the officer shouted, his voice muffled behind the black visor, his breath coming in heavy bursts. Marlon's chest heaved. trying to take in a breath that felt like it was being squeezed out of him. His hands were on the floor, but his eyes were fixed on the chaos unfolding in his own home. Amira was still standing there, rooted in shock. Her face was pale as she stood in the doorway, looking at the police officers who had poured into the house like an invading force, rifles drawn, flashlights cutting through the darkened room. She hadn't moved. She didn't understand what was happening. "Amira, get back," Marlon screamed, his voice hoarse, desperate. But his daughter didn't hear him. Or maybe she did, but she couldn't move, frozen by the sight of what was happening, what had come crashing into their quiet world. One officer, his face hard and unreadable, pointed his rifle toward Marlon. Another pushed past, heading toward Amira, his heavy boots slamming against the floor. "Get down on the ground." Now the officer shouted at Amira, but she was too stunned to react. She didn't even seem to hear him. It was all happening too fast, too violently, too suddenly. The air in the house was thick, almost suffocating, with the sharp smell of gun oil and the adrenaline pumping through Marlon's veins. His mind was racing, his body frozen, as he fought to make sense of it all. Was this a mistake? Was it a raid meant for someone else? "You've got the wrong house," Marlon shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. He tried to push himself up, but the officer's knee kept him pinned to the ground. His heart was in his throat. His daughter, his baby girl, she was still standing there, wide-eyed, trembling, trying to comprehend the nightmare unfolding in her own living room. "Please, don't hurt her," Marlon pleaded, desperation flooding his voice. "She's just a kid. She's just a kid." The officers didn't respond. They were cold, mechanical, their eyes hidden behind dark visors. They didn't care. Amira, still frozen in the doorway, held her hands up instinctively, as if trying to show them she wasn't a threat. But the police didn't see her as a scared teenager. They didn't care that she was terrified. They didn't care that she was about to start college. They saw only a target. Marlon's breath caught in his throat as he tried to push against the officer's weight, but it was too late. The first shot rang out, a single crack of gunfire, echoing off the walls, followed by another, then another. That the officers didn't flinch. They didn't even move. They were machines, operating on instinct, without a care for the life they were taking. Marlon's heart stopped when he saw Amira fall. Her body dropped like a rag doll, her legs giving way beneath her. She hit the floor with a sickening thud, her arms still outstretched, blood quickly pooling beneath her. No. Marlon's body went numb as he struggled against the officer on top of him, trying to push himself up, to crawl toward his daughter. But the weight of the man was too much, and every movement felt like it was happening in slow motion. He managed to roll over, just enough to see her lying there, lifeless. Her blood was everywhere. His beautiful daughter, the one who had a future ahead of her, was gone. In an instant, she had been taken from him. Marlon screamed, a primal sound that ripped through him, filled with agony and disbelief. He could feel the world crumbling around him. How could this happen? How could they do this to her? The officers stood over them, completely detached. There was no urgency, no panic, no attempt to save her. Marlon felt his mind slip into darkness. He couldn't process the horror he was witnessing. His daughter, the girl he had promised to protect, had been taken, and they didn't care. Through the fog of shock, Marlon could hear the officers moving, the sound of boots scraping against the floor. He could hear the distant sound of radios crackling, but none of it mattered. None of it brought Amira back. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was tight, constricted by the grief and anger flooding through him. The weight of the officer on his back felt heavier than it ever had before, suffocating him. "She's gone." The words barely left his lips. The world seemed to spin. The officers didn't look at him. They didn't even seem to notice the wreckage they had left behind. A life was gone, and for them, it was just another operation, just another statistic. And that's when Marlon realized, this wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just a raid gone wrong. This was a system that didn't care about black lives. A system that would never value his daughter's life, no matter how bright, no matter how full of promise she was. The violence had stolen her from him, and he would never let that go. The house was empty, hollowed out by the silence that pressed down on everything. The soft hum of the fridge, the distant drone of a car passing by outside. Nothing could fill the space left by Amira's absence. Marlon sat in the middle of their living room, a room that had once been full of light and laughter. Now it felt like a tomb. Her things were still everywhere. The couch where she used to curl up to read her books, the papers strewn across the kitchen counter, half-finished homework assignments, the little things she had left behind, untouched, as though waiting for her to return. He hadn't moved in hours. His body felt heavy, like it was sinking into the floor, the weight of his grief pulling him down. His fingers trembled as he traced the edge of the frame that held a high school diploma piece of paper that had once symbolized everything she was going to become, now a cruel reminder of everything she would never have the chance to do. Her graduation photo was next. She had been standing there, so proud in her cap and gown, her smile so wide that it could light up the darkest room. The girl who was going to become something, the girl who had so much ahead of her. Marlon couldn't stop staring at that smile, so full of promise. How had it all been taken away so violently? The weight of the photograph in his hands made him feel like his lungs had collapsed. The air around him had turned thick, suffocating. The grief wasn't just in his chest anymore, it had spread through his body, deep into his bones. She was gone and there was nothing he could do to bring her back. Nothing at all. His mind flashed back to moments of her life, the way her voice had filled their home, how her laughter had bounced off the walls, how she had been the light of his existence. He had raised her to believe she was worthy of everything she dreamed of. And now, with her taken so suddenly, all those dreams had turned to dust. The hours passed in a blur, the darkness creeping through the windows as the evening settled in. Marlon hadn't realized how much time had slipped by until the soft sound of the TV in the corner caught his attention. He hadn't even noticed it was on. He hadn't meant to watch it, but as he turned his eyes toward the screen, he found himself frozen in place. The news anchor's voice filled the room. The tragic death of 17-year-old Amira Black has been ruled a case of mistaken identity after a routine raid went awry. Local authorities have stated that no charges will be filed against the officers involved. The words hit Marlon like a punch to the gut. He felt the blood drain from his face, a cold wave of disbelief washing over him. He could feel his pulse racing, each word from the news anchor growing heavier, more suffocating, until his body felt like it was going to break. Mistaken identity, a routine raid, no charges. His hands balled into fists, the sharp pain in his palms bringing him back to reality. The anger came next, rising from the depths of his sorrow like a tidal wave, a wave that had been building ever since they'd come into his home, guns drawn, and stolen his daughter's future. They hadn't just taken her life, they had taken the very essence of everything she had worked so hard for. The dreams she had for herself, her future at Howard University, her chance to make something of herself in a world that often felt stacked against her. Marlon stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor, as if he had been jolted awake from a nightmare that never ended. His breathing came fast, shallow, like he couldn't catch his breath. Mistaken identity, the words burned in his throat. Knew this wasn't a mistake. Marlon's eyes moved to the corner of the room, where Amira's college acceptance letter sat on the table, untouched. He hadn't had the strength to open it. The golden seal was still there, unbroken, her future written in ink he couldn't bear to face. She would never get to see that campus. She would never walk across that stage, shake the dean's hand, or have her name announced as a graduate. All of it had been stolen from her in an instant. And the system, the same system that had killed his daughter asterisk, the system that claimed no one would be held accountable for this crime asterisk, it didn't care, it never did. He had always known that, but now, the reality of it hit him with a force he couldn't ignore. The system had failed them. Amira was nothing more than a casualty of their ignorance. Her death was just another statistic they would soon forget. Marlon's eyes narrowed as his rage simmered, bubbling up from a place deep inside him that had once been filled with love and warmth. Now it was filled with raw, unyielding anger. His thoughts became a blur of violence and retribution. He felt a gnawing hunger in the pit of his stomach, a need that was starting to take root in him, one he didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't deny. He needed them to feel the weight of what they had done. He needed them to suffer that. As the days went by, Marlon's grief deepened, but with it came the gnawing sense of determination. He found himself waking up every morning with a strange, tight feeling in his chest, like something was slowly unraveling within him, something he couldn't control. The tools in his garage, the ones he had used for years to fix cars, became his tools of war. He started spending hours alone in the dimly lit space, his hands working with a precision that surprised even him. Each turn of the wrench, each spark, from the welder, felt like an act of defiance. Marlon's world had narrowed to just one thing now: revenge. He didn't care about the world outside his garage anymore. All he could focus on were the names and faces of the officers who had taken his daughter's life. Their indifference to the destruction they'd caused. He couldn't let it go. The world outside his garage had become a blur of noise protests, news reports, angry voices on the street. He didn't care about that anymore. He didn't care about anyone else's grief. He cared only about his daughter's death, about the justice he knew would never come from the system that had betrayed him. He had to do something that as he continued to work his hands became calloused, stained with grease and sweat. The familiar hum of the garage, the rhythmic clink of metal against metal, started to feel like his new reality. It was the only thing that made sense anymore. In those long, quiet hours with only the flickering light above him and the hum of his tools for company, Marlon found himself remembering her Amira, her laughter, the way she used to light up a room with her presence. How proud she had been when she had received that letter from Howard. She had been so full of life, so full of promise, and now, she was gone. With each hour spent in that garage, building and crafting something he couldn't yet name, Marlon became someone else, someone with a singular purpose, a man transformed by grief into something darker, something more dangerous. As he picked up the hammer, a new resolve settled over him. The world had taken his daughter, but he would make them feel the weight of their crime. He wasn't done. Not yet. The soft hum of the auto shop's fluorescent lights had always been a comfort to Marlon. It had been his sanctuary for as long as he could remember. The smell of grease and rubber, the sound of tools hitting metal, the rhythmic clink of wrenches and hammers. He had spent years here, fixing cars, building engines, making things work. It was a place where he could lose himself in the routine, in the predictability of turning a broken machine into something whole. It had always been simple, and it had always felt like home. But now, everything had changed. The shop, which once felt like a refuge, had become a workshop for vengeance. The tools that used to fix broken engines now served a different purpose. The smell of grease and metal still lingered in the air, but now it felt like the scent of something darker, something deeper, something born from grief and fury. Marlon moved quietly through the space, his steps calculated, deliberate. He was no longer the mechanic who could fix a busted carburetor or replace a broken muffler. He was something else now. The transformation had been slow, subtle at first, but with each passing day, the shift within him had become undeniable. He was no longer just a father mourning the loss of his daughter. He was a man on a mission. A man bent on making the world pay for taking everything from him. His eyes flicked over the tools hanging on the walls, each one once used to heal, now poised to exact punishment. He moved toward the workbench, where scattered blueprints, a roll of duct tape, and metal sheets waited for his hands to shape them into something new. The workshop, once neat and orderly, now felt cluttered, disorganized, as though the tools themselves were a reflection of the turmoil that had consumed him. Every space, every corner, was filled with pieces of a plan that was slowly coming together. He had begun by collecting items, things that would help him make sure the officers who took his daughter's life would feel the same helplessness and fear that Amira had felt when they stormed into their home. The feeling of powerlessness, the feeling of being completely exposed, vulnerable. Marlon's hand hovered over a metal rod, his fingers brushing the cold surface. It was a start, but he couldn't do it alone. His eyes drifted toward the corner of the shop, where a homemade welding mask sat atop a nearby workbench. It had once been used to make repairs on old car frames, but now it symbolized something different, something darker. The mask felt heavy in his hand when he lifted it, the metal pressing against his face like a symbol of his new identity. The man who was no longer the humble mechanic, but a vigilante figure who would stop at nothing to make the police officers feel the fear he had felt the night they killed his daughter. The mask was more than just a tool. It was a metaphor for the man he had become. The face he had once worn, the father, the protector, the provider, had been torn away, shredded by the brutality of that night. And now, with the mask, Marlon could feel himself losing what little of himself was left, his humanity slipping through his fingers. Every cut, every spark from the welder, was pushing him further from the man he had been, the father he had been. He could barely recognize the man in the reflection anymore, his face obscured by the metal mask that represented his transformation. He moved toward a pile of old blueprints on the table, spread out with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The first attack was going to be simple, a message, something small, just enough to send a warning to the officers who had taken his daughter, just enough to make them understand that he wasn't done yet. His hands worked with precision, assembling a crude device, something that would make a loud enough noise, something that would stop them in their tracks. The tools felt foreign in his hands now, as if they no longer belonged to the man he used to be. The wrenches and hammers that once fixed the world were now preparing to break it. As he worked, his thoughts drifted to Amira, to her bright eyes, full of hope and excitement. Her college hoodie, folded neatly on the corner of the workbench, caught his eye. It was a symbol of everything she had wanted, everything that had been taken from her. He could still smell the faint scent of fabric softener on it, and it brought a wave of grief so deep that it almost made him drop the tool in his hand. Her dream was alive in that hoodie, and it was everything he had left of her. Her future had been stolen in a single moment, and all he had now were memories. But he could do something about it. Marlon stepped back from the workbench and picked up the college acceptance letter that had been lying untouched on the table, the one she'd never get to read. It was still sealed, the gold-embossed university logo staring back at him as he ran his fingers along the edges of the envelope. It was the last piece of her future. He turned it over, carefully, and slipped his fingers beneath the flap. The paper inside was smooth, pristine, but it was never going to be opened. He folded the letter back up, careful to keep the crease intact, and tucked it into his pocket. For later. Later when he would make them pay. The plan was coming together. The tension in the air around him was thick, almost suffocating. He could feel it, the building anticipation, the need to move, to act. It was a cold, methodical feeling, different from the helplessness that had initially consumed him. The grief had given way to something darker, something purposeful. His hands moved with an exacting focus now, no longer trembling in sorrow, but steady, unyielding. Every step was calculated, every move deliberate. Outside, the world continued on, but Marlon's world had stopped. He could barely remember what it had been like to be the man. He had once been the father who grilled ribs on a summer evening, who watched his daughter's face light up when she talked about her future. That man seemed like a lifetime ago. Now, everything he touched turned to something darker, something more dangerous. The sound of the grinding tool against metal filled the room, drowning out any lingering thoughts of the world outside. The tension was palpable now. The once familiar routine of his shop had turned into a rehearsal for something he could no longer stop. He was too far gone to turn back now. His eyes scanned the shop. The shelves filled with tools he had known intimately for years. Wrenches, saws, drills, all once symbols of rebuilding. Now they had become symbols of destruction. He paused for a moment, allowing himself a brief reflection. What had happened to him? The rage and grief that had consumed him had transformed him into something unrecognizable. But in this new form, he was focused, determined, methodical. His rage was no longer wild, but controlled. The anger was still there, but now it had a purpose. It was a tool, just like the ones he was using to craft his devices. His hand brushed over a pile of discarded metal parts, pieces he had carefully selected to turn into something Mara trapped. A weapon, a statement. Marlon's eyes narrowed as he saw the final pieces fall into place. The device was ready. It wasn't much yet, but it would make its mark. A warning. A reminder. The first move was done. The door to the shop creaked open, and Marlon paused, his hand resting on the workbench, his eyes fixed on the devices he had created. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The darkness of the night enveloped the small suburban neighborhood like a suffocating blanket. The street lamps cast eerie pools of light across the cracked sidewalks, shadows shifting in the wind, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Marlon's truck idled at the corner, the engine humming softly, barely audible over the distant sounds of the city. He had been watching for hours, waiting for the right moment. His first strike was a message, a warning dot. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. It was about making them feel what he felt, the cold grip of helplessness, the shattering of everything you thought you could protect. And tonight, one of the officers who had stormed into his home, the officer who had shot his daughter, was about to pay the price. Marlon's grip tightened on the steering wheel. His pulse was steady, the quiet rhythm of his breath filling the truck's cabin. The tools he had assembled in his garage, the traps, the devices, the schematics, all of them had led to this moment. This wasn't recklessness. It wasn't about the chaos or the violence. It was precision, calculated, cold, methodical. He watched the officer from his vantage point on the corner, observing him through the rearview mirror. The man was walking down the street, casual, unaware. Marlon knew everything about him now, the officer's shifts, his routines. He had done the groundwork, mapping out his target's every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The officer's name was Daniels. He was the first to kick down Marlon's door, the first to pull the trigger. And now, he was walking alone, vulnerable. Marlon's breath slowed as he slid out of the truck, his movements silent, precise. The streets were empty, the world unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon him. He moved through the shadows, blending into the night, a ghost in the city he had once called home. Every step was deliberate, every movement was part of the plan. His eyes never left Daniels, following him as he turned the corner, his silhouette framed by the flickering streetlight. Marlon kept his distance, just out of view, just close enough to strike without warning. He had practiced this over and over, visualizing the moment in his mind until it felt like second nature. No hesitation, he was in position. Now. No, Marlon pulled the small device from his Paquita trigger, a mechanical switch that would activate the trap he had set. It was simple, yet effective, a wire connected to a small metal plate, rigged to flip under Daniel's feet. A fall that would knock him out, leaving him vulnerable. The trap was set. The first phase was already in motion. Daniels turned toward the alley, his footsteps echoing softly in the silence. Marlon's heart pounded in his chest, but he was calm, laser-focused on his target. He waited for the officer to step closer, each footfall like the ticking of a clock winding down toward the inevitable step, step, step. And then it happened. Daniels stepped onto the metal plate. There was a loud crack, the sound of metal twisting under weight. In an instant, Daniels lost his footing, crashing to the ground with a sickening thud. His head struck the pavement with a hard smack, and for a moment, there was nothing but the ringing silence that followed. Marlon stood frozen in the shadows, watching him for a brief second, ensuring the officer was unconscious. It had worked, but Marlon wasn't done. He moved quickly now, his steps silent as he closed the distance between them. He reached down and grabbed Daniels by the collar, pulling him roughly into a sitting position against the cold brick wall. Marlon's breath was steady, his hands surprisingly calm as he tied Daniels' hands behind his back, securing him with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The plan was unfolding perfectly. Marlon took a step back, his eyes scanning the officer's unconscious face. This was justice. This was for Amira, for the life that had been stolen from her. But even as the thought passed through his mind, a flicker of hesitation flashed across his face. He stood there for a moment longer than he should have, looking down at the officer. He had been a man once, had families, had loved ones just like him. The momentary feeling of doubt made his stomach twist. Could he really go through with this? Could he take another life, even one as tainted as this man's? The hesitation didn't last long. Marlon knew what he had to do. The pain inside him was overwhelming, but it was not for him to carry alone. He had been betrayed by the system, by men like Daniels. This was the only way to make them listen. The moment he let that thought settle in, the weight lifted off his chest, the hesitation disappeared. There was no turning back now. Marlon pulled a small syringe from his pocket. The contents a paralyzing agent designed to keep Daniels conscious but unable to move. He plunged the needle into the officer's neck, the liquid slipping into his bloodstream with a practiced flick of his wrist. Daniels' body stiffened for a moment, but his eyes fluttered open. What's happening? Daniels mumbled, his voice strained, panicked. The paralyzing agent made it difficult for him to speak or move, but his fear was palpable. You're going to listen to me now, Daniels. Marlon's voice was calm, too calm, as he crouched down in front of the officer, his eyes locked with Daniels unwavering. There was no fear in Marlon anymore, only a cold, unrelenting purpose. You're going to feel what she felt, helpless, afraid. Daniels tried to scream, but it was muffled, his lips barely able to form words as his body struggled against the drug coursing through his system. Marlon's hand shot out, gripping Daniels by the throat, his fingers tightening just enough to remind him who was in control now. The officer's eyes widened in panic, his breathing shallow, quick. But Marlon didn't kill him. He didn't need to, not yet. Instead, he let go. He didn't want Daniels to die. Not yet. What Marlon wanted was to make a statement. He wanted Daniels to feel the weight of what he had done. He wanted him to understand that the lives of people like Amira mattered, that justice would not be ignored. You're going to be scared for the rest of your life, Marlon whispered, his voice dark and cold. You won't know when I'm coming, but I'll be there. You'll remember me, and you'll remember her. Marlon stood up slowly, stepping back, leaving Daniels to struggle against his restraints. The officer's breath was ragged, but his body could do nothing. The fear was already building in him, growing like a cancer. Marlon had planted the seed. Now it would grow. As he turned to leave, the first rays of dawn began to light up the sky, casting an eerie glow over the scene. Marlon moved quickly, blending into the shadows again, his footsteps silent as he disappeared into the night. His heart was still pounding, but now it was the beat of someone who knew the path ahead. He had made his first move, and the message had been sent. The air was thick with tension in the days following the first strike. The news spread fast, as news outlets began reporting on the assault on Officer Daniels, labeling it a vigilante attack. The police force scrambled to control the narrative, but the damage was done. People were talking on street corners, in cafes, on social media. The public was divided. Some saw Marlon as a hero, others a dangerous criminal. But what was undeniable was the fear that had settled over the police force. The ambush of a single officer had sent shockwaves through the system, rattling the fragile confidence of law enforcement in a city already on edge. Marlon's name began to circulate among the officers, and the fear of the unknown began to take root. It was no longer about who would be next, it was about when. In the days that followed, police presence in the city intensified. Helicopters hovered in the sky, their spotlights sweeping across alleys and rooftops. Patrols became more frequent, their sirens blaring in the dead of night. Officers doubled down on security measures. Checkpoints appeared on every major intersection. They were hunting Marlon, but what they didn't realize was that they were no longer chasing a man, they were chasing a symbol. Marlon's truck had been spotted. His face was now known. The photo of him, captured from a security camera outside the alley where Daniels had been ambushed, had spread across every news station. For the first time in days, Marlon could feel the weight of the world shift. He had been expecting it, but the reality of it was still heavy. The police were coming. For him, they would stop at nothing to catch him, and with each passing hour, the walls around him were closing in. Yet, despite the growing danger, Marlon didn't stop. He moved quietly, swiftly, always one step ahead. His actions had escalated. The first attack had been just the beginning. Now he wasn't targeting individuals, he was targeting the system itself, the entire structure of corruption and brutality that had taken Amira's life. But the world wasn't standing still for him. The tension in the air was palpable. The police were getting desperate. In their attempt to silence the growing fear within their ranks, they began to strike back. Dawn raids, surprise checkpoints, threats. Their retaliation was swift and aggressive, but it wasn't enough. They couldn't catch him. Not yet, but they were getting closer. Marlon had begun to notice the changes in the streets. People were looking at him differently. There were whispers now, and not just from the police. The community was on edge, torn between fear and sympathy. His name was on the lips of every person he passed on the street. He had become a symbol not just of loss, but of vengeance. The weight of his decisions began to settle in, slowly, a suffocating pressure building within him. There were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when he questioned himself. Had he crossed a line? What had started as a desperate attempt to find justice for Amira had evolved into something darker, something bigger. He wasn't just avenging his daughter anymore. He was fighting a system that had failed them both. And there was no turning back now. His hands were still stained with the grease of his former life, but they were now the hands of someone who had been transformed. The mechanic, the loving father, was gone. In his place was a shadow, a man who had become both the hunter and the hunted. Marlon had no illusions. He knew the price of his actions, but with every passing day, his resolve grew stronger. Each strike he made wasn't just a message, it was a declaration of war. He wasn't going to stop until every officer involved in the raid, every person who had allowed the system to continue unchecked, felt the consequences. He would make them all pay. But even as he moved forward with brutal precision, something gnawed at him. There were moments of doubt. He would be lying if he said he didn't feel it. One night, as he crouched in the shadows of a rundown building, watching the officers move in coordinated formations down the street, a brief flash of doubt crossed his mind. Was this really justice? Was the pain he was causing the same as the pain he had felt when they took Amira? He had to remind himself it wasn't about bloodlust. It wasn't about revenge. It was about the message that no one could get away with this, the message that Black lives mattered, that Amira's life mattered, and the world couldn't just pretend it didn't. He had to keep pushing forward. For her, for every life that had been unjustly taken. The city, meanwhile, was changing. The police were cracking down on anyone who looked suspicious, anyone who dared to speak out. There was no distinction anymore between the protesters, the citizens, and the criminals. Everyone was a potential target. The streets were filled with the noise of helicopters, the rumble of armored vehicles, and the harsh commands of officers. They were all looking for him. But Marlon wasn't afraid. He had become the thing they feared the most. He had been an invisible man once, just a father, just a mechanic, just another face in the crowd. But now he was a ghost, moving through the city unnoticed, unseen, always a few steps ahead. They couldn't stop him. They could try, but they couldn't catch him. And the more they tried, the more they exposed the cracks in the system that had been in place for so long. The police chief stood at a podium for a press conference one afternoon, his face tight with frustration, his voice wavering slightly. "We are doing everything in our power to find this vigilante." He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darting nervously to the side. "This city will not be held hostage by fear. We will not let this criminal get away with this." Behind him, a map of the city was dotted with pins, marking where Marlon had struck. Each location was marked with a red X, each one a symbol of defiance, a reminder that the system was broken. The chief could talk all he wanted, but Marlon's actions were already speaking louder than any press release. Marlon watched the broadcast in silence from the shadows of his garage, his hands working over the next device he was building. He could feel the weight of the world pressing in on him, the weight of every decision he had made. He knew what was coming. The next move had already been set in motion. The city was about to become a battlefield, and Marlon was ready. But as he tightened the screws, the hum of the machines and tools filling the space, he felt it again, that brief pang of doubt, like a knife twisting in his gut. He shook it off, but the feeling lingered. Was he becoming something else, something unrecognizable? He wiped his hands on a rag, leaving behind a smear of oil, and took one last look at the photo of Amira on the wall. Her smile, frozen in time, a memory that felt like a lifetime ago. She was the reason he was here. She was the reason he was doing this start, and as he stood there, the weight of his grief pressing against him, he realized something that he had known deep down all along. He would never stop, because he had nothing left to lose. The night air was thick with tension, the kind that seemed to hang in the space between breaths, waiting for something to snap. The city, which had once felt so alive, now felt dead, frozen in place, caught between the weight of what had happened and what was about to come. Marlon had known this moment was inevitable. He had been pushing toward it from the very first strike. But now that it was here, now that everything was set in motion, the weight of it all pressed down on him harder than ever. He was cornered. Marlon moved silently through the dimly lit alley, the cold concrete beneath his boots like a grim reminder of the journey he had taken to reach this point. The sound of distant sirens, a constant hum in the background, was now joined by the steady footsteps of the officers closing in. They were everywhere now, blocking the exits, surrounding the streets, cutting off his escape. The police had finally figured it out. They had figured out that he wasn't just targeting individuals. He was hunting them all, every officer, every symbol of a broken system. Marlon's truck had been tracked. His face was known. His movements were being monitored, and yet, he still managed to slip through their fingers, always staying just one step ahead. But this time, the trap was set. This time, they were waiting for him. They had learned from their mistakes, and they weren't going to let him slip away. He moved quietly, the darkness enveloping him like a second skin. Everything had come down to this moment. The tension in the air felt like static, crackling, as though the world was about to explode. Marlon's breath came in shallow bursts, but his hands were steady. He wasn't scared. He hadn't been scared for a long time. He was focused, and in a way, that focus had become a numbness. He paused. At the corner, his eyes scanning the street ahead. The final officer was there, the last one involved in the raid, the one Marlon had been hunting for days now. Officer Williams, the one who had led the team that stormed into his home, the one who had pulled the trigger. And now, he was standing just ahead, unaware of the danger closing in around him. Marlon's pulse quickened. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for, the moment he had envisioned in his mind countless times since that night. He had tracked this man, studied his habits, learned his routines. Tonight, the cycle would finally be broken. As the plan unfolded in his mind, a strange, almost surreal calm washed over him. This wasn't about winning anymore. It wasn't about being the last man standing. It was about something much deeper. It was about the void that had been carved into his soul when they took Amira from him. And no matter what happened now, he knew that void would never be filled. The officers in the street were waiting, but Marlon had already anticipated their movements. He wasn't trapped, not yet. With a steady breath, Marlon pulled the small device from his pocket, the one he had built himself. It was simple, nothing flashy, but it was effective. A remote trigger, designed to disable the streetlights, plunging the area into darkness. His eyes locked on Williams as he took his position. The moment was here. Marlon pressed the button, and the world around him plunged into a suffocating, absolute darkness. The silence was deafening for a moment before chaos erupted. Marlon moved fast, his footsteps almost silent as he closed the gap between him and Williams. He knew where the officer was, could hear his movements through the darkness. Williams' hand was reaching for his gun, but he was too slow. Marlon was already on him, There was no time for words, no time for anything but the purpose that had driven him all this time. Marlon's hand shot out, gripping Williams by the wrist, twisting it with precision. The officer cried out, trying to fight back, but Marlon had anticipated the movement. Every action, every movement, was planned. He pushed Williams hard against the cold brick of the building, pinning him there with a force that left the officer gasping for breath. The sound of Marlon's own pulse in his ears was the only thing he could hear now, drowning out everything else. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was acting his grief, his rage, all of it funneled into this moment. Williams' eyes were wide with panic, his voice trembling as he begged, "Please, don't do this, I'm just following orders." Marlon's eyes were hard, cold, following orders. That was what they all said, wasn't it? They followed orders, and then they went home to their families, never once thinking about the lives they were destroying. You followed orders, but you don't get to walk away from this. Marlon's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried all the weight of everything that had happened, everything that had led to this Amira's life. The broken system. He looked into Williams' eyes, and for a brief second, he saw the same fear that had gripped him the night of the raid, the fear of losing everything. But Marlon wasn't done yet. He didn't want this man to die, not yet. He wanted him to understand. He wanted him to feel the weight of what had happened. He wanted him to feel helpless like Amira had felt when the police stormed into their home. Marlon tightened his grip on the officer's throat just enough to make him struggle for air, just enough to make him understand that there was no escape now. The officer's eyes were bulging and his breath was coming in ragged gasps. Marlon held him there for what felt like an eternity, watching as the life drained from him, not in a physical sense, but in the way his soul seemed to wither under the weight of his choices. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, Marlon let go. He stepped back, watching the officer crumple to the ground in a heap, gasping for air. He was alive. For now, Marlon stood there, panting, his heart thudding in his chest. The adrenaline was fading now, replaced by something else, something hollow. Had done it. He had confronted the last man who had been a part of that night. He had exacted revenge for Amira, but in that moment, as he looked down at Williams, he realized something. It didn't feel like victory. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like emptiness. His eyes fell on the officer, still gasping on the pavement, his chest heaving in desperation. Marlon knew what he had to do now. He had to walk away. He had to leave. Justice had been done, but at what cost? What had he really accomplished? The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, distant, at first, but growing louder, closing in. Marlon took one last look at the wreckage of everything, his daughter's life, his own humanity, and walked into the shadows. He disappeared into the night, the darkness swallowing him whole, leaving behind a city that had been irrevocably changed. The city had returned to its usual hum, but nothing felt the same. The bright lights of the streets seemed dimmer, the air thicker, as if the events of the past few weeks had stained everything in their wake. The sound of sirens still lingered in the distance, but now, there was something different about them, something empty, like the sound of a song played on a broken record. It didn't matter anymore. The damage had already been done. Inside the police station, the chief sat alone at his desk, his face drawn and tired, the weight of it all pressing on him. His once pristine uniform now seemed a mockery of authority, hanging on him like it no longer belonged. His fingers rested on the edge of his desk, tapping lightly, but there was no rhythm to it, just the soft sound of a man lost in thought. The files stacked on his desk, the photos of Marlon, the maps with red X's marking where the attacks had happened, they were all reminders of his failure, of his complicity. He had known this would come to this. He had always known that the weight of a badge wasn't just about authority, it was about responsibility, and he had failed to uphold that responsibility. The people had known it, the officers had known it, and now, sitting alone in his office, he knew it too, that it hadn't just been Marlon who had been consumed by grief. It had been him as well. The pressure of the job, the constant balancing act of protecting a city and maintaining order, it had worn him down, piece by piece. But it was the raid, the one that had started it all, that had broken him. He had authorized it without a second thought, too blind to see the lives that would be ruined in the process. Too blind to see Amira. The chief's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk, the skin of his knuckles paling. He had failed her. Outside, the world continued as it always did. The street lights flickered on as night settled in. Cars honked in the distance. Children played in the streets, unaware of the tragic history that had unfolded on their block. But the world felt quieter now, heavier. The chief stared at the empty chair across from him. The one that would never be filled by Marlon. The one that would never again be filled by the lives lost. Marlon, meanwhile, had become something else entirely. He wasn't the mechanic anymore. He wasn't a man, he was a symbol. A symbol of vengeance, of a system broken beyond repair. The last images the city had of him were not of a father or a man trying to grieve, but of someone who had been consumed by his pain and anger, using it to turn the city into a battleground. He was no longer a person. He had become the embodiment of justice, but at the same time, he had lost himself in that pursuit. Marlon was somewhere out there, but it didn't matter where anymore. He was running, hiding, evading capture, but he wasn't running from the law. He was running from the void in his chest, the emptiness that had been left when Amira died. The emptiness that could never be filled. No victory, no retribution could fill it. The city was quieter now, but the streets still held whispers. People still looked over their shoulders, still wondered if the next officer on patrol was the one who would be targeted. The world had become a place of uncertainty, not just for the police, but for everyone. There were no answers, only questions. Had Marlon gotten justice for Amira, or had the cycle of violence just turned another corner, perpetuating the same pain, the same endless loop? The chief leaned back in his chair, his eyes staring into the empty space in front of him. The weight of his decisions felt heavier with every passing second. Marlon's name would haunt him forever, but so would Amira's face, the bright innocent girl whose dreams were never realized. The raid had destroyed more than one life. It had destroyed the city's sense of safety, the officer's sense of duty, and the father's heart. There would be no peace. Not for anyone. The streets were still, as if the world itself was holding its breath, and in the quiet, the final realization hit. The cost of revenge had been too high. Nothing would ever be the same again.